and a lot of people think we're kind of weird. At one point, though, in history, the poet was a very important figure. At times, poetry readings were the equivalent of rock concerts, and especially charismatic poets like Lord Byron could draw crowds and be heartthrobs. And in many societies, in a lot of the ancient societies, the poets were very, very important because they preserved the lore and the learning and the stories, and poets were sacred. In some cultures, among the Celtic Druids, there was a class called the bards that were the ones who knew all the stories and histories and also had to create poetry. And it's interesting, a lot of us are familiar with the Vikings and their raiding and ravaging and all that. Part of their job was, after they went out and did all their Viking stuff, they had to come back to the mead hall and create a poem about what they did. And Egil Skallagrimson, who was one of these fierce warriors who fought kings and all that, was also known for his poetry about what he talked about. And so poetry has been part of world tradition, and poetry can range from something as short as a haiku or 2 or 3 words put together to epics such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad and the Odyssey and Beowulf and these great epics from our past that sometimes are all we have to know about these people. And in more recent times, there is a strong history of poets within both the Unitarian and Universalist tradition, and in some cases before we were UU, and a lot of these poets were still Unitarian, and a lot of their work was both theology and expression, because poetry is also another way of understanding our spiritual beliefs. It might be finding more inspiration in a poem than in reading about religious tracts, and a lot of sacred texts such as the Bible or the Quran have some beautiful poetry as well as a lot of Homer's odes and poetry as a way of understanding what your concept is of deity, or finding what may not be deity, but some spiritual inspiration in nature, in people, in feelings, in love. And one of the movements that came out in Europe was the Romantic movement, which was understanding the emotion and bringing a focus to the individual. Because for a lot of history, there was a lot of focus more on community and the state, the city, the village, whatever communal group you had, and the individual was expected to sort of go along. And yet with the Romantic poets, the individual expression. With the Enlightenment, it was a time of intellectual questioning, it was a time of spiritual questioning, and a lot of the poets started looking to their own emotions as a source of inspiration, as well as to a lot of mythology and their own response to it. And one of the founders of the Romantic movement was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a Unitarian for a while. He was a Unitarian preacher for a while, and he influenced a lot of the Transcendentalist movement in this country. He believed in the inherent goodness of people and nature, which was also a Universalist value, which reflects later on in our principles. From 1794 to 1799 was his main period of activity as a Unitarian preacher. He did suffer from poor health, anxiety, depression, and yes, he used laudanum, which led to an opium addiction, because that was, unfortunately, they didn't have modern medical science that can help with depression now. One of his most famous poems, which we're not going to read today because it's too long, is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which brought us the metaphor of the albatross around the neck, which is still in common use today. And another very famous example that we'll hear in a moment is Kubla Khan. And this is the dream. And this is one thing I think that stops people from being creative, is they have this idea of how wonderful and beautiful my poem or my song or my painting could be, and then they feel like I could never measure up to it. And that becomes a handicap. And yet, even in trying for the dream, you'll get something. It may not be here where you wanted it to be, but here is better than zero. And the only way to grow is to follow that dream. So we'll begin with Kubla Khan, which did follow one of Coleridge's dreams after he'd been reading about Xanadu, which was the summer palace of the Mongol ruler Kubla Khan. And Rachel Coble will be reading this for us.
An excerpt from Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, an internally unfinished poem because the vision fled the poet. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift, half-intermittent burst, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks, as once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion, through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. Amid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such deep delight would win me, that with music loud and long, I would build that dome in the air. That sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard would see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honey dew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise.
Thank you, Rachel. And now I want to mention another poet, an American Unitarian, Amy Lowell. Her style is very different, whereas Coleridge is very ornate and rich language. She was an imagist poet focusing on very precise language, and she wrote in free verse. She was from Boston, from one of those rich Boston Brahmin families, so her wealth gave her a certain privilege. Her family did not want her to go to college because they didn't consider it proper, but she was an avid reader. She was a lesbian. She smoked cigars. She was considered to have mannish dress. Had a little more freedom because of her class than someone who did not have that privilege. The downside is that her work was denigrated, that she's just a rich dilettante, she's a woman, how can she be any good? Ezra Pound in particular was very, very critical of her. And because of her lifestyle, let's just say the Unitarians of that time were not quite as liberal as they were now, so sometimes Her relationship with her own church was a bit prickly, but she did endow a window in her home church on her death and posthumously won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. And this poem is a bit of a different style, also reminding us of our urban lifestyle and how it can sometimes be a disconnect. This is London Thoroughfare, which Barb will be reading.
A London thoroughfare at 2 a.m.
We need to bring it closer.
Okay. They have watered the street. It shines in the glare of lamps, cold white lamps, and lies like a slow-moving river, barred with silver and black. Cabs go down it, one and then another. Between them, I hear the shuffling of feet. Tramps doze on the window ledges. Night walkers pass below along the sidewalks. The city is squalid and sinister, with the silver-barred street in the midst. Slow-moving, a river leading nowhere. Opposite my window, the moon cuts clear and round through the plum-colored night. She cannot light the city, it is too bright. It has white lamps and glitters coldly. I stand in the window and watch the moon. She is thin and lusterless, but I love her. I know the moon, and this is an alien city.
And next we'll have a Mary Oliver poem. She was a poet whose work was very, very accessible. She could write about ecstasy as well as nature. She would take a lot of walks and she would write about the flowers and the trees and all of the animals that she would see. She would see things like shorebirds, water snakes. She would follow the phases of the moon. She would write about whales. And she said she once found herself walking in the woods and didn't have a pencil to write with. So she started stashing pencils in the woods just in case she was out there and needed to write. So she'd be able to get that thought down right away, because we all know sometimes we think of things and, oh, I'll remember that. Oops. So she wanted to make sure that she had all her work. We have 3 poems by her in our UU hymnal. One was our opening reading. She also gave the Ware Lecture at the UU General Assembly in 2006, so she's very familiar to a lot of UUs. And she had such a practical awareness of the world. She was not sanitizing about nature, because sometimes nature poets get, oh, nature's so beautiful. She was aware of the predatory predator-prey type relationships, because some animals do have to hunt and kill to survive, so she did not sanitize that, and yet she still kept a sense of beauty around the natural world. She was also another poet similar to Emily Dickinson's, who was very, very private, cherishing her privacy, not giving interviews, and she was also a winner of the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. So this is one of her poems called Angels that Cheryl will read for us.
Angels by Mary Oliver. You might see an angel anytime and anywhere. Of course, you have to open your eyes to a kind of second level, but it's not really hard. The whole business of what's reality and what isn't has never been solved, and probably never will be. So I don't care to be too definite about anything. I have a lot of edges called perhaps, and almost nothing you can call certainty. For myself, but not for other people. That's a place you just can't get into, not entirely anyway, other people's heads. I'll just leave you with this. I don't care how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's enough to know that for some people, they exist and that they dance.
So we had a poem about angels. We need to give the devil his due, of course. This is a poem by Robert Burns, who is considered the national poet of Scotland. He was a romantic poet. He was a collector of folk songs, and I'm sure you've all sung one of his most favorite pieces. He wrote Auld Lang Syne, which most of us sing in various stages of sobriety on New Year's Eve. And he never actually joined a Unitarian church because at his time he found it a little more politic to identify with the Church of Scotland. But he's celebrated by Scottish Unitarians as a forebear. He had a lot of connections with English Unitarians, Joseph Priestley and Theophilus Lindsay. And in a lot of his poems, he would mock Calvinism. And Robert Burns lived from 1759 to 1796, which was a time when there was still a lot of churches with very, very heavy dogma, and the devil was considered this very real and very frightening being that you had to avoid or he would ensnare you. So, of course, Bobby Burns wrote a poem mocking the devil, and who better to read it than Joe? So...
The old bugger of a grandpa couldn't make here today, so he sent me in his place.
Enunciate, dear.
Can you hear me? All right, I'm enunciating enough now, aren't I? O Prince, O Chief of many thrown pores, that laid thee in battle seraphim to war, O thou, whatever title suit thee, Ald Horny, say to Nicker Cluty, close while in your cabins grim and sooty, close under hatches sprays about the brunstone cootie, to scald poor wretches, hear me, old hangy, for a wee, and let poor damn bodies be. I'm sure they small pleasure it can gie into a dale to skull and skull pull dags like me, and hear a squeal. Great is thy poor and great thy fame, for kenned noted is thy name. For thou, Lord, and hold by him, thou travels far, and faith dies neither lag nor lane, nor blame the score, whilst raging like a roaring lion, for praying holds a corner's trying, whilst on the strong wind tempest flying, tearing the kirks, whilst in the human bosom prying, unseen thou lurks. I've heard the Reverend Granny say, in lamely glens you like to play. Not oh, where old ruined castles grey nod to the moon, ye fright the needly wanderer's way with elderly croon. Pay attention, there will be a test after this. When Twilly did me granny summon to say her praise to those honest woman, and yonder deek she heard ye humming, with airy drone and roasting through the boortries coming with heavy groan. Aye, dreary, windy winter night, the stars shot down with skleeting licht, and when myself I get afraid, I yaunt aloud, ye lash rush bush stood in sight, unwavering roy. The cudgel in me never did shake, each bristled hair stood like a stake, with elded stir quick, among the sprays. Away ye squatted like a drake, on whistling wings. Let warlocks grin and withered hags tell how ye on ragweed nags, then skin the muirs and dizzy craigs. With wicked speed the kirkyards renew their leagues, ochre hoard died. Thence contra weaves with toil and pain, may plunge and plunge the keer in vain. For all the yellow treasure ta'en by witching skill, and all the 12 pain Hawkins gain and yield a bill. Trends that mystic notes make great abuse, young guidemen fawn keen achus, when the best war lunin house thy cantrip wit. An instant made, worth a loss just a wee bit. When throws dissolve thy snotty hovel, and float the jinging icy brood, then winter kelpies haunt the fjord, by thy direction and night travellers allured to their destruction, and aft your massy traverse spunkies, decoyed away and lad drunkies, the blazing cursed mischievous monkeys, delude the ease, until some misery slot he sinkies, near mere to rise. When Mason's mystic word and grip, in storms and tempests rise your up, some cock or cat your rage maun stop, and strange to tell, the youngest britter ye wad and whip, off has straight to hell. Long sign in Eden's home bonny yard, with youthful lovers first were paired, and all the soul of loving shared, the raptured hour, sweet fragrant flory sweared in shady boor. Then ye old sneak-drawn doggy, ye came to paradise in cog, and played a man and cursed a brogue, blach be the fa, and gear in finnered water shog, mace ruined Do you mind the day when in a biz with Ricky dudes, you reached that keys?
You can see him later for the translation.
What? You couldn't understand a word I was saying?
All right, dear. Thank you. So, obviously, taking on the devil. Yet, some poets struggled internally. And another Unitarian poet who had a great struggle with depression and anxiety was Sylvia Plath. And unfortunately, in her time, shock therapy was the treatment. And her poems are very, very personal. She had a type of poetry called confessional that is very much the soul-bearing. For a lot of people, it can be very healing. Unfortunately, it was not enough to heal her. She struggled with suicide throughout her life, and she was treated multiple times for her depression. She wrote a lot about her own experiences. She also suffered a miscarriage. And recently, letters to her psychiatrist have surfaced indicating that her husband was physically and psychologically abusive towards her, and there's some people, oh, I know him, he was a nice guy. I tend to think he probably was on the abusive side, because in so many cases, women do suffer from domestic abuse and don't report it, or it's denied or overlooked. And I feel like that contributed to her ultimately taking her own life. So it's possible that a lot of her own struggles she was not able to receive the help she needed. But she wrote a lot of poems detailing her struggle, which also are meaningful to people who are undergoing struggle, because so often we are convinced to put on the happy face and buck up, and being able to discuss the internal turmoil or that feeling that things are not going right is also a way that poetry can help a lot of that find expression and lead to a healing. So Ashley is going to read a poem called Lady Lazarus, using the metaphor of Lazarus who rose from the dead.
All right. I have done it again. 1 year in every 10. I manage it. A sort of walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. My right foot a paperweight. My face a featureless, fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin. Oh, my enemy, do I terrify. The nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth, that sour breath will vanish in a day. Soon the flesh of the grave cave, it will be at home on me. And I am a smiling woman. I am only 30. And like the cat, I have 9 times to die. This is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments the peanut crunching crowd shoves into sea.
them unwrap me hand and foot, the big striptease gentlemen and ladies. These are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bone, nevertheless, I am the same identical woman. The first time it happened when I was 10. It was an accident. The second time I meant to last it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut as a seashell. They had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. Dying is an art like everything else, and I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell, so it feels so real, you guess I could say I have a call. It's easy enough to do in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical. Come back in broad day to the same place, same face, same brute, amused shout, a miracle! That knocks me out. There is a charge. For the eyeing of my scars, there is a charge. For the hearing of my heart, it really goes. And there is a charge, a very large charge, for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So, Herr Doctor, so Herr Enemy, I am your opus. I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts to a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir, flesh and bone, there is nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. God, Lucifer, beware. Beware, out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air.
And now to bring us back, another Mary Oliver poem, Breakage with Barb.
I hate to have to follow that. I go down to the edge of the sea, how everything shines in the morning light. The cusp of the whelk, the broken cupboard of the clam, the opened blue mussels, moon snails, pale pink and barnacle scarred, and nothing at all whole or shut, but tattered, split, dropped by the gulls onto the gray rocks, and all the moisture gone. It's like a schoolhouse of little words, thousands of words. First, you figure out what each one means by itself, the jingle, the periwinkle, the scallop, full of moonlight. Then you begin slowly to read the whole story.
So, two very different takes on breakage and healing. And we have one more poem. It's by a living poet, Everett Hoagland, who was born in 1942. He's Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Massachusetts and a member of the First Unitarian Church in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He's the first poet laureate of New Bedford, and his work has a lot of the cultural and psychological sense of racial division, but he's also set it to the rhythms of jazz, and as has happened with a lot of African American poets, a lot of his work has been overlooked by critics. And this is a poem of his spirituality called Invocation that Cheryl will read for us.
Invocation by Everett Hoagland. Architect of icebergs, snowflakes, crystals, rainbows, sand grains, dust motes, atoms. Mason whose tools are glaciers, rain, rivers, ocean. Chemist who made blood of seawater, bones of mineral in stone, milk of love. Whatever you are, I know this, spinner. You are everywhere, in all the ever-changing above, whirling around us. Yes, in the loose strands, in the rough weave of the common cloth threaded with our DNA on hubbed, spoked spinning wheel that is this world, solar system, galaxy, universe. Help us to see ourselves in all creation, and all creation in ourselves, ourselves in one another. Remind those of us who like connections made with similes, metaphors, symbols. All of us are, everything is already connected. Remind us as oceans go, so go we. As the air goes, so go we. As other life forms on Earth go, so go we. As our planet goes, so go we. Great poet who inspired, in the beginning was the word, edit our thought so our ethics are our politics, and our actions the afterlives of our words.
And so we have a mosaic of poetry, different styles, different feelings. I hope this will inspire your own work, and hope to see some of you back for our poetry reading. And our closing hymn, All Our Architects, are by another UU poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote a lot of poems in rhyme. He wrote the Hiawatha story, the Ride of Paul Revere, and worked with a lot of legends. So please rise in body and spirit for All Our Architects, number 288.